This November marks the 20th anniversary of Metroid Prime, a milestone that is particularly impressive due to the fact that this game, and the trilogy it spawned, is still relevant. Physical copies of the games remain in high demand, they are widely modded and emulated for PC, and continue to be discovered and enjoyed by newcomers, 2 full decades after Prime's original release in 2002. A great deal has already been said about the success of these games, so my goal with this video is not to simply toss another rose onto the Prime legacy, but rather to examine and elucidate the trilogy's exceptional design in context of the highly anticipated and elusive sequel, Metroid Prime 4. Updates regarding the project have been virtually non-existent since the news that it was being passed back to Retro Studios in 2019, so we still don't have a clear idea of what to expect, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it turns out similar to the recently released Metroid Dread in the sense that it's a reboot as much as it is a sequel. And while it's inevitable for the series to be modernized in significant ways, my hope is that Retro retains the foundations of the Prime Trilogy, building upon and learning from the many ways in which those games excelled. It is these fundamental qualities that I'm going to cover in this video, which will take the form of 10 separate lessons pulled collectively from the trilogy. 3 from Prime 1, 4 from Echoes, and 3 from Corruption. These lessons comprise distinct points of excellent game design in all areas: level design, gameplay design, narrative design, and so forth. And I believe that by incorporating each of these points in its own way, Prime 4 could turn out to be an exceptional, authentic Metroid experience and a solid continuation of the series. You'll notice that some of these points apply to all 3 games, so to some extent it's arbitrary which installment I've matched each lesson with, but I did try to pick the most notable qualities from each game while also considering which had the clearest examples to use. One final note before we dive in. While the trilogy is the primary focus here, it does not exist in a vacuum, having been strongly influenced and shaped by the mainline 2D games. I will periodically refer to these titles in order to provide greater context, but do keep in mind that these are supplementary references since the Prime Trilogy has established its own unique identity as a spin-off series. And now, starting with Metroid Prime. Lesson number 1. Treat story and exploration as 2 sides of the same coin. Prime takes a fairly unconventional approach to storytelling, one that has unfortunately led some players over the years to write it off as lacking depth. And on the surface, it's easy to see why. The game has no dialogue, cutscenes are few and far between, and the premise of saving the world from evil space pirates feels relatively generic. This narrative minimalism is very divergent in comparison to the traditional linear narrative design of most games, especially those in the AAA sphere. However, those who take Prime's story only at face value like this are missing the big picture. This story is not about you. It's about Talon 4. Samus and the space pirates are each but one part of a larger story about the Chozo and their beloved planet, a story which is told primarily through the scan visor. In a very literal sense, this single ability defines what the Prime games are all about: exploring, observing, and understanding. As you explore each region of the game and scan the diverse flora and fauna that populate Talon 4, you gradually come to understand the inner workings of this magnificent world and, like the Chozo before you, feel inspired to save it from the corruption that will inevitably consume everything unless you intervene. The voices of the Chozo themselves are heard through the logbook entries that can be obtained by scanning wall carvings scattered throughout the ruins of their civilization. On a high level, these messages include a history of the cataclysm that altered their world forever, the steps taken by the Chozo to lock the threat away, and prophecies of Talon 4's eventual salvation that Samus and the space pirates are actively fulfilling. For Samus, this fulfillment primarily takes the form of the artifact hunt that eventually enables her to access the impact crater and cleanse the planet of its phazon corruption once and for all. This is the overarching narrative of Prime, but it is certainly not all the game has to offer in the story department. As you progressively infiltrate the research and mining facilities of the space pirates, the scan visor can be used to hack into data systems and learn a wealth of information about their discovery of and experimentation with phazon, a sub-story in and of itself, which plays a big role in the game and goes on to provide a foundation for the rest of the Prime Trilogy. And here we get to the key point of this section. Because the story of Prime is inseparably linked to the scan visor, the amount of story you get out is directly proportional to the amount of effort you put in. If you neglect to use it, you will consequently miss huge swaths of the story and probably be confused by the time the credits roll. But on the flip side, thoroughly exploring and scanning the environment around you will reveal a multi-layered story with surprising depth. A good example of Prime's fusion of exploration and storytelling is its foreshadowing of major boss encounters in the game, including Flagra, Thardus, the Omega Pirate, and Metroid Prime. In the areas immediately preceding them, you'll find a variety of scans, some seemingly unimportant, that hint at the conflicts to come. For Thardus specifically, there are 7, 4 of which are found in the map station off of the research entrance, with the remaining 3 placed intermittently throughout the Hydra labs. In these scans, you learn of a mysterious Project Titan involving a violent test subject, experimentation with phazon ore that can bind stones together, and the importance of thermal imaging technology in studying the properties of this ore, including its weaknesses. You also learn that the East Quarantine Cave is heavily restricted. All experiments have been suspended pending pacification of the subject, it is nearly invulnerable and therefore proving untrainable, and finally that thermal visors have been deployed to aid in its transportation to a more secure site. These scans are a subtle yet detailed way to gradually build anticipation for the coming conflict, as you can't help but feel a morbid curiosity to know what manner of strange creature this might be. And because these hints are all buried in the environment, only those who thoroughly explore with the scan visor will experience the build-up towards this fight. If you choose to skip the scans, then the appearance of Thardus will appear totally random and fail to have the same impact that it would have otherwise. While I don't expect Prime 4 to link the scan visor with narrative as heavily as we see here, after all, even the trilogy's own corruption started moving away from it, the principle of linking story with exploration is a timeless one, and a defining characteristic of these games that Prime 4 will be all the better for keeping. Lesson number 2. Balance strength with vulnerability. A unique quality of Prime's design is how fail states are few and far between. Unlike many games that give the player very limited health and require dying repeatedly to learn the systems and make progress, Samus's power suit here is incredibly durable and well armed, and as a result, player deaths are quite rare and will likely occur only to bosses. Even at the very beginning of the game, with just a single energy tank, you feel pretty strong, and this strength increases dramatically with each additional energy tank discovered. Additionally, obtaining the Varia suit, Gravity suit, and Phazon suit upgrades increase your combat shielding, which means early enemies that used to be dangerous eventually become unable to do more than tickle your energy levels. And your offensive capabilities increase along with your defensive ones as you acquire missile expansions and the powerful wave, ice, and plasma beams. Yet despite giving the player so much compounding strength, Prime still manages to provide a very tense experience, and it does this through atmosphere, by creating fear through isolation. There are several great examples of this. The Phendrana lab sequence leading to and from the thermal visor, exploring the crashed frigate, and the opening section of the Phazon mines, the latter of which I want to discuss in greater detail. The Phazon mines, the last area of the game and one that you've been hearing about for some time now. You've finally made it. After clearing out the main quarry and recharging in the adjacent save station, you begin the descent into the heart of space pirate operations. And from the very first room, it's clear that this is unlike any challenge you've faced thus far, as you encounter beam troopers, the toughest common enemies in the game, which can only be harmed by the beam corresponding to their color. These are also accompanied by the dreaded shadow pirates that can sneak up on you while invisible, which creates a problem. The shadow pirates can only be detected with the thermal visor, but the beam troopers can only be differentiated through the combat visor, which means you'll not only have to switch between your beams, but also between your visors at times. This leads to frantic moments of reconfiguring in which you are left vulnerable, which is made all the worse by the fact that these rooms are all very claustrophobic and cramped, leaving you nowhere to run. You fight your way through room after room, expecting a save station to be placed around every corner, but it surprisingly never comes. Finally, your energy drops low enough that you start to become actually worried and think about turning back, but at this point you're in too deep. You're too weak to fight all the way back up. At this point, the reality of your situation sinks in. You're surrounded on all sides, completely alone, and if you fail, there will be no one to rescue you. Finally, you reach your objective, the central dynamo, and here this gauntlet culminates in the form of a sudden enemy unlike any you've faced before. A cloaked sentry drone that can't be scanned, can't be targeted, and must be fought in almost total darkness. I still clearly remember from the very first time I played Prime that this was the most intense part of the whole game. The cloaked drone is a mini-boss encounter that breaks all the rules. You can't scan it to learn what its weaknesses are, you can't lock on to be sure you are hitting it with your beam shots, you are very far from the last save station with critically low energy, and the boss doesn't even have a health bar to let you know whether you're even damaging it or not. Fortunately, if you keep your wits about you and quickly switch to the wave beam, which at this point you've learned is the weapon most suited to dealing with robotic opponents, and are able to follow the drone's light patterns, you can probably destroy it before it gets the best of you. But there's still one more step to go before reaching that glorious save station right in this room. You must navigate the electrical grid leading up to the power bomb ability. Like the drone fight preceding it, this small sequence wouldn't be a big deal placed anywhere else in the game, but right here, when your health is probably critically low, those electrical coils really do feel dangerous. Upon successfully reaching the power bomb, you are finally in the clear and able to save your hard-earned progress. Along with subverting the player's expectations, this section, from the main quarry to the central dynamo, manages to be so wonderfully tense in part due to one simple principle of gameplay design. Fail states break immersion. Every time you die in a game and get reset to a save point, tension dissipates as your attention is drawn to the artificiality of the experience. If this happens repeatedly, then any sense of immersion is shattered entirely and replaced by frustration. In contrast, the fact that Prime is so sparing with its fail states means that the penalty of running out of energy carries far more weight. The stakes feel more real. In this specific scenario, the last time the player has died was probably to Thardus back in Phendrana, which means they've grown comfortable with their strength and are not expecting the harrowing experience of the Phazon mines. When Prime 4 eventually releases, one of the qualities I most hope to see in it is an atmosphere oozing with immersion, and balancing strength with vulnerability in the ways I've described in this section would be a great place to start. But on the topic of immersion, let's move forward to the next section. Lesson number 3. Build deep interactions and reactions into the world. This is admittedly a very broad category, but a highly important one. Let's start with interactions. In this context, I'm defining the term as the multitude of ways in which Samus directly interacts and interfaces with the world, the key example here being her visors. Each visor built into Samus's power suit enables you to see the world in a different way. The combat visor shows a versatile heads-up display useful for exploring and fighting enemies. The scan visor processes abstract visual information into concrete data. The thermal visor reveals the temperature levels of nearby objects and organisms, and the X-ray visor lets you see through solid objects and detect extra-dimensional entities like the Chozo ghosts. Aside from being really cool abilities in their own right, the inclusion of this visor system does wonders for building immersion into the game experience by calling attention to the fact that these qualities exist in the world even before you're aware of them. For example, everything in this world has a thermal signature whether or not you can see it. It is only by using every visor that you can be sure you're seeing the world in its fullness. Enhancing the immersive properties of the visors even further is the inclusion of a large number of visor effects that will show up in specific conditions. These include Samus's own reflection following bright flashes of light, steam droplets, water rivulets, acid spray, green bug secretions, blue bug secretions, static interference, electrical interference, more electrical interference, yellow warning flashes, thermal visor overload, getting encased in ice, Metroids latching onto your helmet, and more. The sheer depth built into the visor system is really a fantastic way to make full use of the first-person perspective and make the player feel as though they are actually there in the world. One final interaction I've always loved, despite being very subtle, is the fact that Samus's various beam weapons are controlled by her specific hand position. The icon for each beam is a representation of this, and when using the X-ray visor, you can actually see her hand in the corresponding position. This plays no function in actual gameplay, of course, but it's an intuitive and tactile way to show how Samus is interacting with new technology obtained from this world, and it's kind of a bummer that Retro didn't keep this for the Prime sequels. All of these interactions may seem small on their own, but when you combine them all into one experience, the difference it makes really is substantial. Moving on now to the second aspect of this section, reactions. By this, I'm referring to the dynamic ways in which the world directly reacts to Samus. Early on in her mission, while exploring the Chozo ruins, Samus stumbles into what used to be a waste incineration chamber that has now been colonized by a hive of barbed war wasps. Upon detecting her presence and interpreting it as a threat, the long-dormant incinerator drone at the room's center activates and begins torching the room, which of course provokes its resident wasps, and what follows is a mini boss fight that involves fighting off both at once. It's a pretty ridiculous situation when you stop to think about it, but at the same time also feels incredibly organic. It makes sense that the wasps will be drawn to the warmth of the chamber and construct a hive there, and obviously they don't take kindly to their home going up in flames. It really feels as though the environment is directly reacting to your presence. Had Samus simply decided to skip that chamber, it's reasonable to think that the drone and wasp hive would have continued their mutual residence in peace. In addition to scripted encounters like this one, there are also a large number of small and specific reactions in the game as well. The scan entry for the Space Pirates' auto-defense turret states that they must be destroyed with missiles, but if you shoot them with a fully charged wave beam instead, it overloads their circuits and causes them to fire erratically in all directions before exploding. While admittedly not as quick as simply blasting them to bits with a missile, it makes sense logically that strong electricity would have an effect on them, and there's something oddly satisfying about destroying them in this way. Another example dealing with electricity is that pulse bomus, which are creatures composed of pure electricity, are vulnerable to water. There aren't many places in the game where this is even possible, but if you do happen to find them, dragging bomus underwater with your charge beam is a quick way to destroy them. Prime is positively teeming with these tiny interactions and reactions, far too many to cover here, and the end result is a world that actually, truly feels alive. Even playing this game 20 years later, at its original low-fidelity resolutions, I find it to be more immersive than many modern releases with insanely better graphics. It's unfortunate then that modern adventure games tend to forget this aspect of world design in favor of hyper-realistic graphics and sheer map size, neither of which guarantee an immersive experience. Retro studios would do well to avoid this trend and keep their vision small enough and focused enough that they can build interactions and reactions of this depth into the world of Prime 4. Moving on, the next lessons are from Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. Lesson number 4, Embrace Fear. While each is able to provide a satisfyingly tense experience, I think it's safe to say that none of the Prime games create fear quite like Echoes does. Following an excellent intro that could have been pulled straight out of an Alien film, Echoes continues to inject tension and fear into Samus's journey through a variety of means. First, it squarely establishes the main conflict as character versus environment. While the space pirates are a part of the story, there is no mistaking the fact that Dark Aether and its Ing Horde is the real threat here. And by extension, you are not fighting individuals or even organizations so much as fighting against an entire planet that should not exist, and you must do this in total isolation. From the moment you step into Dark Aether for the first time, it is clear that this world hates you and wants to destroy you. The air itself is toxic and drains the energy of your Variasuit at an alarming rate, which forces you to carefully follow the trail of light crystals and beacons in order to stay within their protective fields. Making matters worse, many of these protective beacons are only temporary and will quickly switch back off if not sustained with light energy, which is very easy to forget about when you are surrounded and being attacked by the Ing from all sides. Even the music feels unwelcoming. The soundtrack of Dark Aether is heavy and oppressive, with low-frequency dissonance creating an atmosphere of instability and unease. You eventually obtain the Dark Suit and both the light and dark beams, which considerably improve your ability to handle Dark Aether, but the feeling of vulnerability remains. Both beams have very limited ammunition, and the dark suit still takes persistent damage, and it doesn't help that your suit's sensors are constantly reminding you of the danger. Certain enemies in the game are also able to temporarily disrupt your ability to function, such as the warrior ing who fly through your visor in targeted possession attempts, as well as the resbits that can shut down your power suit and force a hard reboot. The result of designing the environment itself as the primary antagonist in this way is that the experience is able to evoke primal fear. It goes against the player's very instincts to descend into dark ether time and time again and face the terrible creatures that reside there, and even thinking about it may induce dread, but there is no way around it. Layered upon this bed of primal fear is a grim story of existential horror as the Luminoth species is being systematically hunted to the last individual. It's really quite chilling to find their corpses littered all over the world and learn of children fighting and dying on the battlefield, parents and children dying together, and possessed warriors attempting self-annihilation rather than be weaponized by the enemy. And this is no ordinary enemy either, but rather a manifestation of the void itself. One of the most unsettling parts of Dark Ether for me personally is the fact that many of its areas feel unfinished, which I suspect was at least partially a result of the game's accelerated development cycle. Regardless of whether this was intentional or not, it fits very well since Dark Ether isn't a complete world. It's supposed to feel wrong, like a crude imitation of the real thing, and this feeling only grows stronger as you siphon its energy and watch it become unstable. You can't help but wonder, what happens to you if you are still in the realm while it collapses? Death? Or something worse? While it's safe to assume that Prime 4 won't be a horror game in the traditional sense, although that would certainly be interesting, I hope to see it lean into its horror roots like Echoes and craft an experience that makes the most out of its alien setting. This is an area that could greatly benefit from the enhanced graphics of the current generation too. Just imagining Dark Ether fully remade for the Switch is quite a dream, and Prime 4 could certainly go beyond that. Lesson number 5. Establish a compelling motive. While I touched on the narrative briefly in the previous section, this section will go into more depth with a focus on the heart of the story rather than on the role it plays in exploration. Echoes starts with a very clear directive: locate the missing Federation troopers and render assistance as needed. The nature of this contract is such that you expect to find survivors, but after landing on Ether's surface, it quickly becomes apparent that you may be too late. As you work your way through the troopers' makeshift base, now overrun with splinters, you learn the story of their desperate struggle piece by piece through the logs left behind. And that's not all. You also learn personal information about these people, their personalities, their hopes, and their fears. Upon finding the abandoned ship in the GMC compound and watching the final black box recording, it is finally confirmed that there are no survivors, which is really quite tragic. The imagery of the 20 empty seats within the ship is especially effective at communicating loss, and you can't help but think,
that never would have happened if I'd been there.
But of course, this isn't where the story ends. It has only just begun. In her attempt to learn more about this planet and find a way off it, Samus finds Umos in the Great Temple and learns of the Luminoth's plight, and it is here that you realize the story of the Federation troopers is a microcosm of the fate of the entire planet. The Luminoth are on the very brink of extinction, with the last individuals sealed into stasis where you can clearly see them. You may have been too late to save the Federation troopers, but this new conflict isn't over yet. You can do something about it. This intro does a great job of not only showing you that there is a desperate need for your help, but making you feel a desire to fill that need as well. And this is maintained as you progress throughout the game, which does a great job of humanizing the Luminoth by telling you their stories as you find their bodies, as I explained in the previous section. Something else I love about this story is that it establishes Samus as a true hero, someone who does what is right, not just what is easy or required. It's worth pointing out that Samus only really needed to restore planetary energy from one controller in order to leave the planet herself. Once the skies above Aegon were cleared, it surely would have been possible to fly her gunship out. But instead, she stays at her own risk to see things through to the end. Now, I'm not saying that Prime 4 should tell a story just like Echoes. While I'd argue that the latter story is absolutely effective, it is rather basic at the end of the day and could have gone much further in weaving something more complex and multifaceted based on its solid foundation, and this is precisely what I think Prime 4 should strive to do. Craft a story that pushes the boundaries of what have been done thus far, and establishing a compelling motive, as I've explained, will help ensure that such a story lands on its feet. Lesson number 6. Utilize the Morph Ball. Since the beginning, the Morph Ball has been one of Samus's most unique and iconic abilities, and it remains a staple here in the trilogy. Back in Prime 1, we learned that the space pirates were mystified by this technology and tried to replicate it with disastrous results, and they also noted that it was this ability that enabled Samus to infiltrate their Phazon mining facility in the first place. The Morph Ball is so interesting in part because it dramatically changes gameplay, providing you with access to new areas but with strict limitations. You can fit through tiny spaces, launch yourself at high speed with the boost ball, climb rails with the spider ball, and decimate enemies with power bombs, but in exchange are unable to use your standard arsenal of weapons or visors. And while each of the Prime games feature this ability, Echoes makes far more frequent and innovative use of it. The world of Ether lends itself to this, with splinter tunnels in the temple grounds and other biologically created tunnels providing organic opportunities to use the Morph Ball. There's also the sequence in which you break into the space pirate mining base using this ability in what I have to imagine is an homage to the first game. Echoes also features a huge variety of Morph Ball puzzles that are quite impressive, some of the standouts being the Watch Station, Sanctuary Fortress entrance, and Torvus Bog Plaza. The Morph Ball also plays a significant role in combat, with 3 boss fights taking place exclusively in Morph Ball mode, and 3 others incorporating it in at least one phase. All things considered, Echoes did a great job using the ability, but I think there's still a lot of untapped potential that could be utilized in Prime 4. For example, in many cutscenes across the trilogy, we see Samus use the Morph Ball as a way to dodge quick attacks or launch herself high into the air. Due to the technical limitations of the time and challenge of switching between the first and third person perspectives, however, the Morph Ball is admittedly a bit clunky during actual gameplay, with these sections often being treated separately and partitioned off from the rest of the game. I would love to see this line blurred in Prime 4. For example, giving Samus a Morph Ball dodge in addition to strafe could be an interesting way to add complexity both to combat and traversal. But now to address the obvious issue here. This would still be quite challenging to pull off, even with current technology, if Prime 4 keeps the first-person perspective. So, should it? I've gotta be honest, I love the first-person visor and the incredible immersion it makes possible, and it would be really sad to lose that. But on the other hand, converting fully to third-person would enable the developers to make Samus's movement far more nimble and fluid and remove the need for jarring perspective cuts, which would also be awesome. I'm personally torn on the matter, but I think it could turn out well either way. Regardless of which direction Prime 4 goes, it absolutely should incorporate the Morph Ball as a core ability and key element of the game that helps dictate the overall world and level design. For example, what if Samus stowed away on an enemy spaceship using the Morph Ball? Or what if at some point her suit malfunctions and she gets temporarily trapped in this mode? There are so many possibilities here, and I would love to be surprised by what Prime 4 comes up with. Lesson number 7. Craft a soundtrack that is part of the world. This list would absolutely not be complete without talking about the music of Metroid. The Prime games all feature exceptional soundtracks, and I would argue that Echoes might just have the best one. What makes it stand out is that the soundtrack feels just as much a part of the world as the environments themselves, and it is able to achieve this in 2 key ways. By having unique, memorable motifs that give areas personality, and by seamlessly blending music with soundscapes. Anyone who has played Echoes will likely be able to recall its music just from seeing a screenshot of the game, and this is because each area was given a distinct musical atmosphere with very recognizable melodies that have become intrinsically associated with those areas. A great example of this is the Torvus Bog main theme. Upon entering the region for the first time, the unique character of its music will likely be one of the first things you notice. In contrast to the barren and dry-sounding music of Aegon and the Temple Grounds, respectively, the Torvus main theme features a strong rhythm with dynamic accents that help convey the natural rhythm of the region's flowing water and the myriad forms of life that thrive there. And wedged right in the middle of it all is that captivating, theremin-inspired synth melody that bobs in and out, weaving its way through the mix and right into your brain. The track is sufficiently long and complex enough that it never becomes tiresome even as you explore the bog for hours on end, and as you do so, the imperceptible looping of this distinctive melody will, over time, create a strong association between itself and the aesthetic of the bog as a whole. The second aspect of Echo's soundtrack that establishes it as part of the world is the way in which it combines musical elements and sound design to complement and complete the ambient soundscapes of the game. Let's look at some examples, starting with the Aegon Wastes main theme. Formerly a land of lush, green plains abundant with life, Aegon is now a barren, windswept desert where only the most hardy flora and fauna can survive. And its main theme reflects this by using synthesized pads that mimic the intermittent gusts of wind. It also incorporates a static texture strongly reminiscent of an untuned radio to convey the fact that this land is now in a perpetual radio silence. There is no one left either to send signals or receive them. In stark contrast, we have the Sanctuary Fortress main theme. Just as the fortress is a hub of incredible technologies, digital and otherwise, its music is composed of rapid digital patterns that could believably have been generated by the fortress tech itself. The humming of servers, the beeping of control panels, and the granular sweeping of patrol robots. Most notable, however, is the way music helps show the separation of light and dark ether. Let's revisit the Torvus Bog main theme and compare the original version with its dark counterpart. You can hear that the dark version uses many of the same motifs, but they are fragmented and separated from the larger melody. There are also parts where they suddenly cut off, or get gradually detuned as they echo into oblivion, and all the while these motivic phrases are surrounded by dark, ominous drones whose pitches constantly shift in a nauseating fashion. These tracks are clearly recognizable as being for the same area, but are vastly different to reflect the great divide between light and dark ether, one dynamic and filled with life, and the other only a crude and hollow imitation. This duality is the core premise of the whole game, so it's no surprise that every main theme has a corresponding dark opposite. I know this section is running a bit long, but there's one last concept that I feel is worth bringing up. An extension of the idea that music should be part of the world is that the world, in this case, is not just Ether, but all the worlds of Metroid as well, and Echoes nods to this by adapting the Brinstar Underground Depths theme from Super Metroid in the Torvus Bog Subterranean theme. Of course, most Metroid entries have adapted the themes of their predecessors, but what makes this specific example so significant is that Echoes completely reimagined the iconic Brinstar track in its own style, which is the style of Ether. You'll notice that the instrumentation and character of the track perfectly match the Torvus Bog main theme, with the old melody feeling right at home. And the fact that this same melody plays in similar locations on two different worlds, the depths of Torvus and the depths of Brinstar, helps gel them together and supports the idea that the music is simply a part of these natural environments. If Retro wants to make Prime 4 an experience as entrancing and memorable as Echoes, not to mention the other members of the trilogy, then the music needs to be treated as a high priority. Prime 4 absolutely deserves more than the disgrace of a soundtrack given to Dread, and provided Kenji Yamamoto returns to compose it, then I'd say it's in good shape. Even if he doesn't, though, I still think the soundtrack could turn out wonderfully if the composer follows the two principles I've elaborated on in this section. The last 3 points will be taken from Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, which is of particular importance to this discussion since it's the most recent game, and therefore the one Prime 4 will likely resemble the most. Lesson number 8. Preserve Samus's personality. This is a big one, and could be what makes or breaks the game for me personally. Something I've always loved about the Metroid franchise is the character of Samus Aran. Despite being a powerful and feared bounty hunter of unparalleled skill, she never acts with arrogance or aggression and is instead remarkably calm, quiet, and humble. These are qualities very rare to see in an action protagonist, especially now at a time when female leads are all too often written to be loud, aggressive, and witty in order to be portrayed as tough. But it is precisely this juxtaposition that makes her so interesting as a character. In all 3 Prime games, Samus never speaks a single line of dialogue. And while this isn't terribly surprising for the first 2, considering that she is completely alone for much of the time, it was obviously a deliberate choice to preserve this aspect of her personality in Corruption. Samus frequently interacts with other speaking characters, including members of the Federation, the Aurora units, and the other hunters, yet never speaks a single word even in situations where it may seem warranted. And the reason, as I see it, is really quite simple. She doesn't see a need to. Samus is no small talker and can effectively communicate what she's thinking through other methods such as her body language. She is comfortable with herself and her thoughts and doesn't need validation from others, and those who know her understand this. Now, this type of character is admittedly tricky to pull off successfully because the lack of interaction can lead to them being bland or uninteresting, but Corruption effortlessly avoids this by making Samus the focal point of the story and keeping her presence constantly felt by the player. She may not speak, but Samus still has a voice that can be clearly heard in her exertions, and her reflection can be seen on the power suit visor following bright flashes of light, periodically reminding you that this is her story as much as yours. Furthermore, Samus is shown to have weaknesses and vulnerabilities that temper her strength. After destroying the first Leviathan core on Brio, she takes off her helmet and gets physically ill when the Phazon corruption within her begins to spread. This is a very human moment that feels almost wrong to watch due to how personal it is. Additionally, the relationship Samus has with the other hunters is quite interesting. It is clear that these individuals are rivals and only work together due to their shared contract, and the others don't hide the fact that they are wary of and even a bit jealous of Samus, yet she has great respect for them and is quite affected by their deaths later on. In a way, these characters were the closest things to friends that she had, and losing them is a big deal. One of my favorite parts of the entire game is the post-credits scene in which Samus returns to Skytown to meditate and reflect on these fallen hunters. It's such a simple but pure way of showing us who Samus Aran is. She may be quiet and unassuming, but is nevertheless the one driving these stories as she observes, listens, and remembers. And while I would personally prefer this silent version of the character to be maintained in Prime 4, I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to give Samus more of a voice, and that can totally work if done properly. Metroid Fusion does a great job of incorporating Samus's words through her thoughts in a way that feels natural, and her single spoken line of Chozo in Dread was spot on. While we know virtually nothing regarding Retro Studios' plan for Samus with regard to her personality, we do have one small clue. In October of 2020, they posted a job advertisement seeking storyboard artists to work on emotional and interesting and innovative scenes that elevate the narrative. Based on this, it would seem that a speaking version of Samus and a more personal story could certainly be in the cards for Prime 4, and it would absolutely be great to see her character developed further than we've seen before, but for this to land right, it needs to be done in the right way, by preserving the Samus we know and love from the trilogy just as Corruption did. Lesson number 9. Expand the functionality of Samus's classic abilities. I'm a big fan of all of Samus's traditional abilities and have been pleasantly surprised by some recent brand new additions, but I think an interesting middle ground that deserves further exploration is the reimagining of her classic abilities. Corruption does this very well. It introduces many new features, but instead of being completely new, they are rather extensions of the abilities Samus has had all along. The most obvious example here is the concept of energy. What in the other games was simply used as health and nothing more is now treated as a resource with the PED suit and its hyper mode function. This mode enables Samus to weaponize her suit's energy with devastating power, as well as use it for brief periods of invulnerability, the trade-off being that it reduces the amount of energy that can be used as health. Additionally, the grapple voltage ability makes it possible to transmit and siphon energy between Samus's suit and external power sources. While on the topic of the grapple beam, it's also worth noting the other new functions the ability was given in Corruption. Instead of being good only for swinging along grapple points, it can transmit voltage as previously described, and the grapple lasso can be used to pull objects, solve puzzles, attack enemies, and be used as a zipline in Skytown, which, let's be honest, might be one of the best parts of this game, period. All of these interactions feel organic and logical considering the grapple beam's properties, but until seeing them in action, I don't think anyone realized what they were missing. Another old ability given new life in Corruption is Samus's gunship. What for the longest time had simply been a stationary save point is now a dynamic asset that can be directed remotely and be used to travel to different locations, and as the game progresses it can be upgraded with grapple and missile abilities that help progress the story and open up limited opportunities for dynamic usage. Now, an important caveat here is that I don't think Corruption was entirely successful in implementing all of these new features, with some of them being criminally underutilized. I'm extolling the concepts behind these abilities' design more than the specific execution we see here. One specific feature that would be amazing to see in Prime 4 is the ability to actually fly Samus's gunship, which was tested in early builds of Corruption but ultimately scrapped due to the technical limits of the Wii console. But now, with modern development tools and platforms, I have to imagine this is a real possibility. How cool would it be to have physical control of the gunship and take part in all-out space battle sequences rather than simply watching them in cutscenes? A final note I'd like to make while on this topic is that plenty of Samus's original abilities have yet to make the transition from 2D to 3D as was done with the screw attack in Echoes. A true infinite space jump or shine spark could be very interesting implemented into the Prime series for the first time, and could greatly increase the amount of verticality possible in the level design. To be honest, I'm not terribly concerned about this point compared to some of the others in this list, since there's so much room for innovation that it would be pretty surprising for Retro to drop the ball. The key here is to maintain a balance between old, tried and true mechanics that have set Metroid games apart for decades, and brand new features that freshen up the formula in interesting ways. And finally, last but not least, lesson number 10, broaden the Metroid universe. Even among the diverse genre of intergalactic sci-fi, Metroid is something special. While the franchise draws heavy inspiration from Alien in its emphasis on Metroids, its approach to them is significantly different, and it has otherwise set itself apart from this and other sci-fi properties in interesting ways, such as its fusion of the primeval, natural world, and incredible futuristic technology, which can be clearly seen in both the Chozo and Luminoth cultures. Prime 1 and Echoes both do a fantastic job of building diversity into their worlds, with each region having its own distinct character and qualities. However, there is some small degree of limitation in the fact that both games take place on only one planet. In contrast, Corruption features several different worlds that Samus can visit, as well as multiple space stations between them. By spreading out in this way, the game is able to tell many stories at once and allows the player to experience much more of this one-of-a-kind universe. Every area you visit in Corruption feels unique, from Alicia's Skytown to Ice Brio, the GFS Valhalla, and Phase, just to name a few. And the success of these areas is not just in how they look, but also how they make you feel. Skytown is thoughtful and peaceful, yet tinged with sorrow due to the loss of the entire Elysian race that used to dwell there. The floating city is technically a research station, but its atmosphere is much more akin to that of a temple or tomb. Ice Brio evokes mystery and a reverence for the passage of time in several ways, first by showing that the location is obscured from transmissions, implying that the place has long been undisturbed and is, in a sense, timeless, and also by calling to mind memories of Phendrana drifts from your past mission on Talon 4. In contrast, the GFS Valhalla is an unsettling place of death that elicits feelings of loss and indignation, perhaps even anger. And Phase, the living planet, is truly unlike anything you've seen before, eliciting a mixture of fascination and revulsion with its mutated biology and unsettling primal intelligence. Above all, each of these locations evoke wonder, an emotion that has always been a core part of the Metroid experience and comes as a result of seeing and experiencing things that no one has before. One last point. Along with providing a broader look at the Metroid universe, Corruption also recontextualizes the stories you've already experienced in the previous games. It ties together both Prime 1 and 2 by revealing the Phazon Leviathan seeds that had impacted the worlds of Talon 4 and Aether, and also provides new information regarding the happenings on each one since you left. These include the Talon 4 ecosystem recovering fully to its former splendor, and the remains of the Luminoth species actively rebuilding their civilization. While I think it's inevitable that Prime 4 will feature expanded new worlds and locales, since that's what new games do, one possible risk that the team at Retro needs to avoid is sacrificing depth for scope. The temptation to make game worlds as massive as possible is a real one, and doing this to Prime 4 at the expense of deep interactions, like I explained previously in Lesson 3, would be a mistake. Retro should follow the precedent set by Corruption and prioritize depth and variety even as they expand the universe outwards. And with that, we wrap up the top 10 lessons Metroid Prime 4 should learn from the Prime Trilogy. While I've covered a wide range of topics, the through line in all of them is simply this: that the trilogy still holds up today and is a wheel that doesn't really need reinventing. My hope for Prime 4 is that it gives us what we already know and love, but polished and modernized for the current generation, and if it applies these 10 lessons from the trilogy, then I'm confident it will do exactly that. Thank you so much for watching, and the question I'd like to pose to all of you is this: are there any fundamental lessons you think I missed? Or would you like to see Prime 4 leave some of these points behind in favor of new features or ideas? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And finally, if you're interested in seeing future Metroid content like this, especially regarding Prime 4, then please consider subscribing to the channel and leave a like before you go. With any luck, I'll see you next time.